Hey guys, tonight we venture somewhere most mortals never dare to tread, right into the depths of the Greek underworld itself, following the quietest and most misunderstood god of them all. You are standing at the edge of Olympus right now, looking up at all that shining marble, blinding golden light, and chaotic thunderbolts going off like someone's birthday gone terribly wrong. The air smells faintly of wine, sweat, and burnt offerings. You are about to find out why Hades, the so-called Lord of the Dead, would rather hang out in his dark little basement than deal with this circus every day. You will feel the heat of the forge, hear Hera's nagging echo through the halls, and if you are lucky, dodge one of Zeus's wandering lightning bolts. You will also notice that everyone is too busy laughing, bickering, or flexing to even notice you. Which, spoiler, is exactly what Hades felt for, the past few millennia. And a little reality check. You probably will not survive this, at least not in the stories. But hey, we are just here to fall asleep to it all. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from and what time. It is now. Dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge forward, sandals scraping against a floor of polished white stone that is so clean it is kind of annoying. Olympus is loud, like high school cafeteria during Spirit Week loud. The moment you step into the main hall, a wave of sound crashes into you. Laughter, clanging goblets, music from 100 invisible lyres, and someone, probably Dionysus, shouting about his missing leopard. The scent of ambrosia makes your stomach growl, but you cannot even hear it over the din. Over there, Apollo is tuning a harp that looks more expensive than a Ferrari. Ares is arm wrestling Heracles at a table where Hera and Aphrodite are fake smiling at each other through gritted teeth. Poseidon is off in a corner, dripping all over the floor, and muttering something about how no one appreciates a good tsunami anymore, and smack in the middle of it all. But also, somehow invisible, stands Hades. He is dressed impeccably, in dark robes that absorb the light around him, hair slicked back, expression politely bored. No one offers him a drink. No one even acknowledges he exists. You notice that his hands are clasped behind his back, a small frown tugging at his lips. And though his eyes flick from one god to another, they never settle long enough to spark conversation. Historians still argue whether this awkwardness was a deliberate act of rebellion or just how he always was. Maybe he liked being ignored, or maybe it stung a little every time someone called him brooding, like it was an insult. What is certain is this: Olympus was too loud. You inch closer to him, feeling the weight of the atmosphere pressing down on your ears. There's a faint ringing in your head, or maybe it is just the chorus of 9 muses trying to sing over one another. You catch Hades glancing toward the edge of the hall where shadows seem to gather. He exhales slowly, and you swear you see his shoulders relax just at the sight of a staircase that spirals downward into blackness. Too much, you whisper, just loud enough for him to hear. His lips twitch. Not quite a smile, but almost. Even here, Hades carries himself like someone who already knows the ending to the joke and finds it only mildly amusing. You can practically hear his thoughts. Zeus flexing again. Check. Hera side-eyeing Aphrodite. Check. Dionysus dancing on the table. Again. Check. Same play. Different century. In the far corner, you notice Hephaestus trying to fix a candelabra that is somehow on fire at the wrong end. That is your mainstream fact of the night. Historians confirm that the Greeks believed even divine craftsmen had bad days. They thought Hephaestus actually fell from Olympus once because he botched a job and Zeus threw him clean off the mountain. Charming family, right? But here is a quirky little tidbit. A few ancient scrolls suggest that the wine cups on Olympus refilled themselves only if you said please in perfect ancient Greek, which might explain why so many of these gods are already slurring their words. The air grows thicker, with each passing moment. Someone is yelling now. Ares, probably. He is good at that. A golden plate crashes to the floor near your feet, and you feel yourself instinctively inch closer to the shadows, along with Hades. He glances at you, arching an eyebrow like he is just now noticing you are here. You think you see the faintest smirk when another thunderclap echoes through the hall and sends a tray of olives flying through the air. You see, he murmurs, his voice so low you almost miss it. This is why I prefer my own company. You follow his gaze again, toward the dark staircase, and you swear it beckons you too. The noise of Olympus is suffocating, like 1,000 conversations, all demanding to be heard at once. The smell of ozone and roasted goat is starting to make your eyes water. Hades takes one last look around, the corner of his mouth twitching again. You cannot tell if it is irritation or amusement. Then he turns his back on the golden chaos and starts toward the stairs. You hesitate, because, you know, dark staircases that disappear into nothingness do not exactly scream safe. But another bolt of lightning splits the ceiling, showering sparks over the musicians, and you decide, yeah, anywhere is better than here. You follow. The marble beneath your feet grows colder with each step down, the noise above fading into a distant hum. There is a cool breeze curling upward from the darkness, and it smells like damp earth and something faintly metallic. And that is when you realize, here, below Olympus, it is quiet. The walls change from gleaming marble to rough-hewn stone, and the flickering torchlight casts shadows that dance like lazy ghosts. The further you go, the less your ears ring. You can finally hear your own thoughts again. You glance back once, and see only the faintest glimmer of light far above. The laughter and shouting are gone now, replaced by a deep and satisfying silence. And at the bottom of the steps, Hades is waiting. He looks at you, as if to say, took you long enough. You take a deep breath. Down here, in the cool quiet beneath Olympus, you can almost imagine you belong. And honestly, you think you understand why Hades never wants to leave. You stand there for a moment, letting your eyes adjust to the dim light. It feels almost illegal, how good the quiet is. Up above, Olympus still buzzes with endless chatter and clinking cups, but down here the only sound is the faint drip of water echoing off the stone walls. Hades gives you a look that seems to say, well, are you coming or not? And starts walking again. The path ahead twists gently downward, lined with ancient torches that burn with a pale blue flame. It's cool, but not unpleasant. And the air smells of minerals and something sweet you can't quite place as you follow him. Your footsteps muffled by the dust underfoot. You can't help but wonder how he ended up down here in the first place. You've heard the story, of course. Zeus took the sky, Poseidon took the sea, and Hades was left with what was left, the underworld. But the way he carries himself now, calm and measured, you start to suspect there's more to it. Hades glances back at you, as though reading your thoughts. His lips twitch, but he says nothing, and you're left to fill in the silence yourself. The truth is, the so-called unwanted third brother has been the subject of debate for centuries. Historians still argue whether he willingly chose this realm, or if he simply lost a cosmic game of rock people. Some even believe he preferred the solitude from the beginning, seeing more potential in the underworld than in the crowded, petty drama of Olympus. You reach a small archway carved directly into the rock. Above it, faintly scratched in ancient Greek, is a phrase that translates loosely to welcome to the real world. Hades ducks under without ceremony, and you follow, brushing your fingers over the rough stone as you pass. On the other side, the ceiling opens up into a vast cavern. You stop and just stare. It is enormous, and yet the darkness seems to swallow its edges, so you can't even guess how big it really is. Pillars of onyx rise from the floor, carved with intricate designs you can't quite make out, and faint lights dance through the air like lazy fireflies. A river glints far below, its surface eerily still, reflecting pinpricks of torchlight. Hades pauses at the edge of a balcony and surveys it all with a kind of quiet pride. You step up beside him and whisper, "You don't really seem like someone who lost a bet." That smirk again. Just a hint of amusement in the corner of his mouth. The air down here feels heavier, but also softer somehow, like being wrapped in a velvet curtain. A little farther along, you pass through another corridor lined with what look like ancient murals. You stop to study them, and Hades notices. The paintings tell a story. The birth of the three brothers, Zeus striking down Cronus, the division of the world. And then, in the final panel, Hades descending a staircase almost exactly like the one you just walked down. Only in this painting, his expression is different, serene, even content. Quirky fact time. In a dusty manuscript found in a forgotten monastery, a Greek scholar once claimed that Hades actually requested the underworld because he thought mortals deserved a god who would watch over them after death, rather than abandoning them to chaos. That story never quite made it into the popular myths. But standing here now, you can almost believe it. You notice the faint sound of rushing water now, louder as you descend yet another flight of steps. Hades seems to glide more than walk, his dark robes trailing just above the ground. You hurry to keep up. You pass a doorway framed in obsidian. Inside, dimly lit and echoing, is a massive hall filled with shadows that shift like mist. Statues line the walls, their faces worn smooth by time. Some hold scales, others carry swords. It is here that Hades finally stops and speaks. "This was never about punishment," he says softly. "It was about balance." You feel a chill run down your spine, though the air is no colder than before. His gaze sweeps over the hall, as if he is checking that everything is in its place. The shadows drift aside as he walks between the statues. You follow carefully. And with each step the quiet grows more profound. At one point you hear what you think is a laugh, high and brittle, but it fades before you can place it. Historians still argue whether this hall was meant to intimidate mortal souls or simply remind them of their choices. Some accounts even claim that mortals who entered this place often fell into a trance and forgot who they were entirely, their memories dissolving in the silence. Hades pauses before a statue of a woman holding a book and a quill. He reaches out and adjusts the book slightly so it sits evenly on her stone lap. Then glances at you. She keeps the records. He explains simply, "You never know when someone will want to contest a judgment." You let out a nervous chuckle that echoes much louder than you intended. He raises an eyebrow but says nothing. As you continue onward, the path narrows again, the walls closing in. You can hear the river more clearly now, its strange silence replaced by a soft lapping sound. Soon you emerge onto another balcony, this one hanging directly above the river you glimpsed earlier. It glows faintly in the darkness, a silver ribbon cutting through the rock. Across its surface tiny lights flicker and drift, like stars caught in water. The river Styx. Hades murmurs beside you. You peer down at it, mesmerized. It doesn't look frightening, exactly, but there is something final about it. You watch as a faint shape glides over the water, a small boat, steered by a hooded figure with a long pole. "That's Charon," Hades notes dryly. You'd think he'd say hello for once. The boat drifts away without stopping. You can't help but smile at the deadpan humor. The two of you stand in silence for a moment, just watching the river. Then you notice something strange. Along the far bank are faint shadows, hundreds of them drifting aimlessly, as though waiting for something. Hades follows your gaze. "They're still deciding," he explains quietly. "Some souls take longer than others." You watch the figures for a while longer, trying to make out their faces, but they remain just out of focus. After a while, he turns and starts walking again. You follow, and the river fades behind you. Your path winds downward once more. through a tunnel lined with faintly glowing crystals embedded in the walls. The light reflects in his dark eyes as he glances back at you. Just once, Dot. See, he says softly, this is mine. And that, up there, never really was. And you find yourself nodding, though you're not entirely sure why. You reach another vast chamber now, and this one feels warmer somehow, lit by a soft golden glow coming from some unseen source. The floor here is smoother, the walls carved into elegant patterns that seem to shimmer when you look at them too long. And here, for the first time since you left Olympus, Hades seems to truly relax. He stands in the center of the chamber for a long moment, just looking around, and then exhales, like he has been holding his breath for centuries. You feel it too. The strange weight lifting, the sound of your own heartbeat, slowing to match the calm around you. Maybe being the unwanted third brother wasn't so bad after all. You linger there a moment, letting the warm light of the chamber wash over you, until Hades finally begins moving again. His footsteps are unhurried now, softer, as though he has no more reason to hurry away from Olympus. You realize you've never seen someone more at home than he is down here, and you start to understand what it means to truly belong somewhere. The path ahead opens into another hall, narrower than the last, with walls covered in delicate carvings of vines and flowers you don't recognize. Some of the petals glow faintly in the dark, and when you brush your fingers against them, they're cool and smooth like polished stone. Hades catches you staring at the flowers and smirks just slightly. Those were Persephone's idea, he murmurs. She said it felt too gloomy without them. You can almost imagine her here, hands full of blossoms, scattering light into the shadows. At the end of the hall, you hear faint music. At first it seems like a trick of the wind, but as you follow Hades, it grows clearer. Lyres pluck out notes that waver and echo against the stone, and laughter drifts faintly from somewhere ahead. You step into yet another vast room and stop short. It's a banquet, Dot, or at least, it's trying to be. A long table stretches across the room, piled high with food you don't quite recognize, pomegranates split open like jewels, bowls of something that looks suspiciously like molten gold, plates stacked with honey cakes. Gods and demigods lounge in ornate chairs, talking loudly over one another, and raising goblets to toast things you can't make out. It takes you a moment to realize this isn't Olympus, but it's trying very hard to look like it. Hades stands just inside the doorway, shoulders slightly tense now. He surveys the scene with a look that could almost pass for boredom, but you can see the tightness around his jaw. You watch as a demigod bumps into him, without so much as a glance or an apology, before stumbling off to refill his wine. No one offers Hades a seat. No one even looks at him. He moves quietly to the edge of the room, his dark robes blending into the shadows. You follow, trying not to draw attention to yourself. You whisper, "This happens a lot." Hades doesn't look at you, but you see the faintest twitch of his mouth. "Always," he murmurs. You take another look at the room. The chatter feels forced, the laughter sharp at the edges. Every gesture feels rehearsed, every smile just a little too wide. Mainstream fact for the night. According to Greek historians, the gods held countless feasts on Olympus, often lasting days, where mortals and demigods alike were invited to bask in divine company. These banquets were supposedly where alliances were forged, and grudges were born that would last for centuries. And here's a quirky detail you've probably never heard. One obscure legend claims that a certain satyr once tried to crash a feast by hiding inside a giant amphora of wine, only to get so drunk he forgot to come out before the party was over. They say he's still sleeping somewhere in the cellar, but, as you stand here, pressed into the shadows next to Hades, the so-called divine revelry feels more like a performance. The gods bask in their own light, oblivious to anything else. At one point, you see Zeus himself at the head of the table, laughing too loudly, his goblet sloshing golden liquid onto the marble floor. His eyes skim past Hades without pause, landing, instead, on Apollo, who's strumming another tune. You glance at Hades and catch him watching Zeus too. For a moment, there's something in his gaze you can't quite read. Not anger, not envy, just tiredness. You murmur, "Why do you even come to these?" His lips quirk. "Someone has to." The noise swells around you. Plates clatter. Someone starts singing off-key, and a pair of minor gods nearly trip over each other, trying to impress Aphrodite. You wonder how long Hades will stand here, unseen at the edge of the room, before he quietly slips away again. Historians still argue whether these banquets were meant as genuine celebrations or subtle tests of loyalty and rank. Some believe they were more like political theater than parties. Every laugh and toast carefully measured for effect. A goblet shatters. Somewhere behind you and a small chorus of laughter follows. Hades doesn't even flinch. You watch as he finally steps back, blending once more into the shadows, his robes rippling like smoke. You follow, back in the quiet hallway. The sound of the feast fades quickly, replaced once more by silence and the occasional faint drip of water. Hades pauses at a junction in the corridor and rests his hand briefly against the wall. "That was the last one I ever attended," he says quietly. You blink at him, surprised. Before you can ask, he adds, "I thought perhaps it would be different this time." He shakes his head faintly, then moves on. You keep pace beside him, your footsteps echoing softly. After a few turns, you find yourselves in a smaller chamber, lit by a single torch. The air is cooler here, and on the walls hang a few simple tapestries thing like the gilded nonsense upstairs. In the center of the room is a round table set with 2 goblets and a single pomegranate, seeds glistening like rubies. Hades gestures to one of the chairs and sits in the other. You hesitate, then sit. He studies the pomegranate for a moment before pushing it toward you. You shake your head. He chuckles faintly. "It's not cursed," he murmurs. "Not this one, anyway." For a moment, you sit there in silence. The faint sound of the river sticks somewhere far below. He leans back slightly in his chair and lets out a quiet breath. You realize this is his own private space. No gold, no shouting, no endless plates of food no one eats. Just a chair, a table, and quiet. You find yourself smiling faintly. "This seems better," you say. His eyes meet yours, dark and calm. "It is," he replies simply. You reach out and pluck a single seed from the pomegranate, rolling it between your fingers. It feels heavier than it looks, smooth and cool. A faint smirk tugs at his lips as he watches you in the distance. Faintly, you think you can still hear the echo of laughter from the banquet hall, but it no longer seems to matter. Not down here. You set the seed back gently on the table and sit back, listening to the silence. Hades leans forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table. "When you are ready," he says softly, "I will show you the rest." You nod, and for the first time, you understand why the party nobody invites him to is one he's glad to miss. Hades rises from his chair without a sound, and you follow. His robe brushes the ground like a shadow that knows exactly where it's going. He leads you back into the corridor, this time taking a turn that dips even farther down, the air growing cooler and thicker with every step. The quiet is no longer just silence. It feels alive somehow. You can hear your own heartbeat, slow and steady, and the faint shuffle of Hades' feet ahead of you. You reach a doorway framed in smooth black stone, slightly wider than the others, and without hesitation, Hades steps through. On the other side, you stop in your tracks. The underworld sprawls before you. This is not a room, or even a hall, but a vast, endless expanse, as though the earth itself cracked open to reveal another world hidden below. You stand at the edge of a dark cliff, and before you stretches a land of rolling hills and jagged mountains, rivers that glow faintly silver cutting through deep valleys. Above you, The ceiling of the cavern disappears into inky darkness, dotted with faint glimmers of light, like distant stars. And yet, somehow, it does not feel frightening. It feels calm. Hades glances at you, then back out across his realm. His hands clasped lightly behind his back. The first stroll below, he murmurs, was much quieter than I expected. You follow his gaze. He begins walking again, and you step carefully behind him down a sloping path carved directly into the rock. Your sandals slip a little on the smooth surface, and he catches you with a quick glance, but says nothing. Down here, even your own clumsy footsteps sound different, muffled and soft. As you descend, you begin to notice figures. At first, they seem like more shadows, but as your eyes adjust, you see them more clearly, faint shapes, walking slowly along paths of their own, silent and aimless. Some move in pairs, some alone, their faces pale and indistinct. You glance at Hades, but he is watching them too. His expression, unreadable. Historians still argue whether the Greeks actually believed these shades retained their memories, or whether the underworld stripped them clean to leave only their shapes behind. Ancient texts describe both possibilities, but no one seems to agree which is true. A few of the shades turn their heads slightly as you pass, but none of them speak, and none of them meet your eyes for long. The path winds deeper into the landscape, now skirting the edge of a glowing river that seems to hum faintly in your chest. At one point, a breeze curls around you, carrying the scent of damp earth and something faintly sweet, and you shiver. Hades pauses and glances back at you with a faint smirk. You're doing fine, he murmurs. The path flattens at last, opening into a meadow scattered with black and silver grass that ripples gently, despite the absence of wind. You stand there, staring. It's beautiful, in a quiet and haunting way, and you realize that this must have been what Hades saw on his first stroll below, a strange kind of peace. He steps into the grass, and the faint sound of it brushing against his robes is the loudest thing you hear. You follow, feeling the cool blades part around your ankles. In the center of the meadow stands a single tree, its bark dark as obsidian, and its leaves shimmering faintly with silver light. Hades stops beside it, resting one hand lightly against the trunk. It grew here on its own, he says softly. I didn't plant it. You step closer, tilting your head back to take in its height. The branches seem to reach endlessly upward, disappearing into the gloom above. Quirky fact time. Some ancient poets believed there were entire groves like this scattered across the underworld, trees that sprouted from the footprints of gods. They even claimed the leaves whispered the names of mortals who had just crossed over. You stand quietly, listening, and for just a moment, you think you do hear faint whispers rustling through the branches, though you can't make out the words. Hades withdraws his hand from the tree and continues walking. You glance back at it once more before following him into the shadowed hills beyond. The terrain becomes rougher now, dotted with jagged stones and faintly glowing crystals embedded in the ground. The air hums faintly, as though the entire underworld is alive with its own quiet rhythm. Every so often you pass another shade, wandering slowly along its path. One stops briefly to stare at you, and for a second you think it's going to speak, but it simply inclines its head slightly and drifts on. You look at Hades questioningly, but he only says, "They don't always remember how." You keep walking. Ahead, you see the faint glimmer of another river, this one narrower and darker than the Styx. Its waters shimmer faintly red, and it moves more quickly, whispering as it flows. Hades stops at the edge and kneels, resting one hand on the surface. Lethe, he murmurs. The river of forgetting. You crouch beside him, peering into the dark water. For a moment, you think you see faces reflected there, faint and wavering, but when you blink, they're gone. Historians still argue whether Lethe truly erased all memories forever, or merely dulled the sharpness of pain. Some believed it was a mercy, others a curse. You watch as a faint shape drifts past, trailing its fingers lightly through the water, and then continues on silently. You stand, brushing dust from your hands, and glance at Hades. He straightens, his dark eyes calm and steady. "This way," he says quietly, and begins moving again. The path climbs slightly now, curving around a hill of dark stone. At the top, you find yourselves overlooking yet another strange landscape, a series of terraces carved into the rock, each one glowing faintly with its own pale light. On the highest terrace stands a small stone bench. Hades sits. You hesitate, then sit beside him. He gazes out across his realm, hands resting loosely in his lap. "When I first came here," he says softly, "it felt like exile." You glance at him, but he does not look at you, and then, little by little, I realized it was a gift. His voice is quiet, almost lost in the hush of the windless air. "Up there," he murmurs, pointing vaguely toward the ceiling. They never stop speaking. "Down here, at least, I can hear myself think." You smile faintly. You look back out over the terraces, the rivers, the silver meadows, and the endless, quiet figures moving slowly through it all. It is not what you expected, but it is something, and as you sit there beside him, you begin to understand what he means. The first stroll below was not frightening, it was freeing. After a while, Hades stands again, brushing faint dust from his robes, and begins walking toward a path that winds along the terraces. You follow, still feeling the strange calm of the place, settling deeper into your chest. The path curves around a low ridge and then dips downward into a shadowy hollow. At first it looks empty, but as you draw closer, you notice a faint movement near the center. It takes you a moment to realize what you're looking. Atta, massive dog, lies curled at the bottom of the hollow, its body stretched across the stone floor like a small hill. 3 heads rest on its paws, each one breathing slowly and in perfect unison. "Cerberus," Hades says simply. With the smallest tilt of his head you stare. He's even bigger than you expected. Thick black fur, shimmering faintly with some otherworldly sheen. Claws, like polished obsidian tails, curled lazily around him. Each head looks slightly different. One seems older, with a scattering of gray at the muzzle, another with sharper ears and a faint scar across its snout, the last with soft, sad eyes that blink at you curiously. For a creature meant to terrify mortals, he does not seem very terrifying at all. You step closer cautiously, and all 3 heads lift at once, watching you with quiet interest. Cerberus rumbles, low in his chest, a sound that makes the stones vibrate under your feet. But there's no malice in it, more like a tired warning. You freeze, but then notice Hades lowering himself slightly and reaching out a hand without hesitation. The largest head leans forward, pressing into Hades' palm and letting out what can only be described as a content sigh. You watch in disbelief as Hades scratches behind one ear, then the next, then the third, until all 3 heads are practically melting into his touch. Cerberus likes belly rubs. Hades murmurs dry leeb, blinks seriously. Another faint smirk from Hades, very seriously, hesitantly. You crouch and extend your own hand. Cerberus watches you for a long moment, then one of the heads leans down, sniffing your fingers before nudging your palm. You laugh softly and run your fingers through his thick fur, which is surprisingly soft and warm. The middle head lets out a little huff of satisfaction. Quirky fact for you: ancient Greeks believed Cerberus was not just a guard but also a guide. His job was not only to keep mortals from entering uninvited, but also to make sure the dead stayed on their path. Some old stories even say he loved music and would sometimes nap through his shift. If someone played a beautiful enough song, you glance at Hades, who gives the dog one last pat and straightens. Cerberus watches. You both go 3 sets of eyes, following quietly as you move back toward the path. His tail swish once, and then he settles back down into his hollow. With a faint yawn, you climb the next ridge. You glance back at him again, feeling oddly comforted, not so scary. After all, you say lightly. Hades doesn't even glance back, but you catch the faintest twitch of his lips. Depends on the day, he replies. You keep walking, the air cooler again now, and filled with faint sounds you can't quite name. At one point you hear what sounds like faint music again drifting from somewhere far away, but when you stop to listen, it fades. You pass another river, this one narrow and almost black with faint greenish lights drifting beneath its surface. Hades slows and glances at it before continuing but doesn't say anything. Historians still argue whether the underworld rivers were believed to actually flow somewhere specific, or if they simply circled endlessly. The Greeks named 5 rivers, in total each said to represent a different aspect of death and memory, but whether they were physical places or just metaphors remains a question no one agrees. On you follow Hades along a narrow ledge and come to a place where the path opens into another strange meadow. This one is dotted with low stone markers, faintly glowing runes etched into their faces. The air here is cooler and carries the faintest scent of herbs. Ease kneels beside one of the markers and runs a finger over the symbols as though checking something, then straightens and moves. Anu glance at one of the stones, noticing that some of the runes shimmer faintly when you look too long at them, but fade when you blink. What are they? You ask softly. Memories. He replies without looking back. You let that sink in as you trail behind him through the silent field, the stones humming faintly around you. At the far edge of the field you pass beneath an arch of pale rock, carved with delicate patterns you don't recognize. Beyond it, the ground slopes gently downward into another cavern. The sound of water grows louder again, and soon you find yourself at the edge of a wide underground lake. Its surface is perfectly still and reflects the faint lights above, like a sheet of glass. Hades stands at the edge, hands clasped behind his back, watching the water quietly. You step up beside him, peering into the dark depths. Below the surface you think you see faint shapes, drifting slowly, far below, impossible to make out clearly. He finally speaks after a long moment. They always expect it to be fire and brimstone, he says softly. But it isn't. To glance at him, but his gaze remains fixed on the lake. It's just quiet too. Stand there in silence with him for a while, letting the sound of your own breath and the faint lap of water fill the space. Eventually, he turns away and begins walking again. The path from here winds upward slightly, through another tunnel, the walls glittering faintly with embedded crystals that glow softly as you pass. You catch up to him and murmur, "So." Cerberus belly rubs. Really, this time the faintest chuckle escapes him. Every single day, he replies. You can't help but smile at that. When you emerge from the tunnel, you find yourself back at one of the terraces you passed earlier, overlooking the wide, quiet expanse of the underworld. The figures below continue moving at their slow, steady pace. Rivers gleam faintly in the distance, and the soft hum of the place wraps around you like a blanket. Hades stops near the edge and rests one hand lightly on the railing, his expression unreadably. You stand beside him, taking it all in, and you realize that the underworld is not frightening, it's simply his end. He belongs here more than he ever could up there. You glance at him once more and see that faint, almost imperceptible smile tug at the corner of his mouth, and for the first time you understand why. You stay there at the terrace's edge for a few long breaths, while the underworld spreads out before you, quiet and strange, yet comforting somehow. Hades stands so still beside you that he seems carved from the same stone as the railing. When he moves again, it's with a soft rustle of robes and a faint nod toward a narrow stairway that curves deeper into the earth. You follow without speaking. This stairway is older, rougher. The steps are uneven and worn in the center, as though countless feet have passed this way before. The walls grow cooler and damper, and the scent changes, slightly less like stone and more like earth after rain. At the bottom, the path levels out and opens into another chamber. At first you think it's empty, but then you hear it, a low murmuring, soft and endless, like wind through reeds. You step closer and see them, shades. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, seated at long stone tables that stretch into the darkness. They huddle close together, their pale forms faintly luminous in the gloom. Their mouths move constantly, whispering to one another, though you can't quite catch what they're saying. Hades stands at the edge of the room, arms folded loosely, as he surveys them. Ghosts have terrible table manners, he murmurs dryly. You blink at him. One shade knocks over a goblet that rolls across the table and shatters. Another gnaws distractedly on what looks like a pomegranate seed, dropping half of it onto the floor. A third seems to be arguing with herself, her two hands gesturing at each other furiously. The closer you look, the stranger it gets. One pair of shades sits facing each other, whispering so quickly it sounds like a buzzing hive. Another group is huddled in a corner giggling about something none of the others seem to notice. You lean in a little, trying to hear, but their words are slippery, almost like water, and you can't quite catch them. Quirky fact for you. Some ancient texts claim that shades in the underworld spent eternity gossiping about their lives, their deaths, their regrets, their neighbors. One particularly odd fragment even claims that famous poets would visit their own funerals just to hear what people said about them afterward. You glance at Hades, who catches you watching and gives a faint shrug. They have nothing else to do, he explains. Why not talk? One shade notices you and leans toward you suddenly, whispering something sharp and fast before dissolving back into the group. You hesitate, glancing at Hades. Did you catch that? You ask softly. He smirks faintly. No, but it was probably unkind. You take a careful step back from the tables. Historians still argue whether these endless conversations among the dead were supposed to be a punishment, a distraction, or simply an echo of the lives they once led. Some thought it was their way of clinging to the memory of who they had been. Others believed it was nothing but meaningless noise. Hades finally turns from the murmuring tables and begins walking again, his footsteps soft against the smooth stone. You follow him out of the chamber, grateful to leave the sound behind. The next passage is narrow and winding, lined with faintly glowing stones embedded in the walls. It smells faintly of salt now, though you can't see any water nearby. As you walk, you glance at Hades. Does it ever bother you? You ask quietly. He doesn't look at you, but says simply, it's their nature. You nod, though you're not entirely sure you understand. At the end of the passage you step into a smaller room, circular and dim, with a single shallow pool at its center. Hades stops at the edge of the pool and gazes into the still water. You peer over his shoulder and see faint ripples on the surface, though nothing seems to disturb it. You realize after a moment that the ripples form patterns, faint images of faces, hands, fleeting expressions before fading back into the calm. Hades watches for a long time before murmuring, "This is where they remember." You blink at him. All of them, he adds softly, at least for a little while. You crouch beside the pool, watching the ghostly reflections shift and vanish. After a moment, you whisper, "Do they ever stop?" Hades glances at you. Dark eyes, steady. "Sometimes," he says. "But not often." You straighten slowly, the murmurs from the other chamber still faintly echoing in your ears. He steps back from the pool and gestures for you to follow. You climb another gentle slope, the walls here etched with faint symbols that shimmer when you pass. You don't dare touch them at the top of the slope. The air opens up into a balcony overlooking a vast cavern filled with strange light. Below, you can see yet another river snaking through the darkness, its surface shot through with streaks of gold and red. Figures drift along its banks, their shapes vague and shifting. You stand beside Hades, watching in silence. "They'll talk themselves in circles for centuries," he says at last. You glance at him, and you're okay with that. You ask Dot. His mouth curls just faintly. "Better here than up there." You let your gaze fall back to the river below. The lights in it gleam softly, catching on the dark water like sparks on glass. In the distance, you hear faint laughter, brittle, strange, and then it fades. Quirky little detail for you. One old legend claims that if you ever managed to quiet every single shade in the underworld all at once, you could hear the original song of the earth itself. Of course, No one's ever managed it. You stand there for another long moment, before Hades turns and starts walking again. This way, he murmurs. You follow. Feet echoing softly on the stone, and behind you, the ghosts keep whispering, on and on and on. The path narrows again as you follow him away from the balcony, leaving the faint whispering and strange laughter behind. The air grows warmer now, faintly fragrant, and you catch a faint trace of something sweet like ripe fruit. Hades moves more, deliberately now, slower somehow, and you get the feeling he's leading you somewhere that actually matters to him. After a few more quiet turns, the corridor opens suddenly into a sunlit space, or at least, it looks like sunlight. The ceiling is high and vaulted, glowing softly gold as though the sun itself decided to visit the underworld for just a little while. You blink against the brightness, and when your eyes adjust you see her, Persephone. She stands at the center of a wide marble terrace, scattered with potted plants and flowering vines, even here, at the heart of the underworld. She has coaxed a garden out of the shadows. Her hair catches the golden light, her hands full of blossoms you've never seen before, petals like drops of ruby, vines that shimmer faintly silver in the air. For a moment, she doesn't notice you, humming softly to herself as she tucks a sprig of something fragrant into one of the pots. Hades stops just inside the terrace and watches her quietly. You do too, and then, as though she feels your gaze, Persephone glances up. Her smile is quiet and warm, and somehow it softens even the stone beneath your feet. "Welcome," she says simply. Her voice is low and clear, and it carries through the garden without disturbing the stillness. Hades steps forward at last, and you catch the faintest change in his expression. Not quite a smile, but closer than you've seen so far. Persephone moves toward him, slipping a blossom into his hand, and then turns to you with a polite nod. You realize, awkwardly, that you've been staring. "Sorry," you murmur. She just laughs, soft, like wind through leaves and waves. You closer. You step into the garden, the scent of earth and flowers wrapping around you immediately. The vines seem to sway faintly in your direction as you pass, as though acknowledging you. Quirky fact for you. Some ancient stories claim that Persephone brought seeds of impossible plants from the surface down with her and coaxed them to grow here, even in the dim light of the underworld. One obscure hymn even calls her the first true gardener. You glance around at the flowers now, realizing how alive they feel. One pot glows faintly, with delicate blue blossoms that smell faintly of rain. Another bursts with red blooms that seem to pulse like tiny hearts. Persephone catches you staring and smiles faintly. "They're harmless," she says gently. You nod quickly, though you're not entirely convinced. She crouches near a particularly lush vine and gestures for you to join her. You kneel beside her and watch as she carefully teases out a single seed from the soil and holds it up between her fingers. "This one's my favorite." She says that the seed glints faintly gold, like a drop of sunlight caught in her hand. She presses it back into the soil and pats the earth around it before standing again. Historians still argue whether Persephone truly loved the underworld or simply made the best of her situation. Some claim she wept for centuries. Others believe she chose this place as much as Hades did. Watching her move through the garden, quiet and sure, it's hard to imagine her as anything but at home here. Hades leans against one of the marble columns, dark eyes following her calmly. One point she brushes her fingers lightly across his sleeve as she passes, and he almost smiles. You catch the moment and pretend not to notice. After a while, she pauses near the center of the terrace, glancing at Hades. "Show them the fountain," she says softly. Hades inclines his head and beckons you forward. You follow him through a small arch covered in flowering vines, emerging into another smaller courtyard. In the center stands a fountain, carved from dark stone, water bubbling up, silently and spilling into a shallow pool. Petals float lazily on its surface, catching the faint light from above. Hades stops at the edge of the fountain, resting a hand lightly on its rim. This is hers. He says simply. You kneel to look more closely at the water. It glows faintly from within, and for a moment you think you see faint shapes in its depths, blossoms opening, hands brushing against soil, something like sunlight caught in motion. Persephone appears beside you again, kneeling gracefully and trailing her fingers through the water. It reminds them of home, she murmurs. You look at her questioningly. The souls, she clarifies. They come here sometimes, to feel something alive. You glance back at the fountain, and watch as the petals swirl, lazily, glowing faintly against the dark water. Quirky little detail. Some very old tales say that Persephone's fountain could even make the dead dream again. If only for a moment. You sit back, letting the scent of flowers and faint sound of water fill the space around you. For the first time since entering the Underworld, you feel something like warmth settle in your chest. After a while, Persephone rises and dusts her hands lightly against her skirt. Hades straightens as well, his gaze calm but softer somehow. Come, he says quietly. There's more to see. You rise and follow, glancing back at Persephone once before stepping through the arch again. She offers you one last quiet smile before turning back to her garden, her hands already busy with the flowers once more. As you leave the terrace behind, the scent of blossoms still clings faintly to your clothes, and you find yourself smiling just slightly, and you think to yourself, no wonder she came back. You follow Hades away from the warmth of Persephone's garden, the faint sweetness of her flowers still lingering in your senses, even as the air cools and darkens again. The path now slopes gently downward into yet another vast space, though this one feels heavier somehow. You can hear faint murmurs ahead, not the giggling and gossip of the earlier ghosts, but slower, quieter, more deliberate. As the shadows part, you find yourself standing at the edge of a strange hall, lined with benches carved into the stone. On the benches sit shades, dozens of them, leaning toward each other in clusters of twos and threes, whispering in tones that almost sound conspiratorial. You step closer, and their words grow clearer. My neighbor cheated me, one hisses. He promised to return the ox, and he never did, another grumbles. And she wore white to my funeral. Can you believe it? Two freeze for a moment, realizing you're hearing complaints. Complaints about their lives, their deaths, each other. Hades glances at you over his shoulder and murmurs, they never stop. You watch as another group leans closer together, whispering sharply about some long-forgotten scandal. One shade waves her arms, as though demonstrating just how unfair it all was, her hands passing through the air like smoke. Quirky fact for you. Ancient Greeks sometimes buried the dead with a coin under the tongue for Charon, but also tucked written complaints or petitions into the grave. Apparently the dead were thought to carry grudges all the way into the underworld, where they could continue arguing about them forever. You take a cautious step forward, and one of the shades snaps its head toward you and whispers something fast and unintelligible before turning back to its circle. You glance at Hades, who simply raises an eyebrow. If you listen too long, he murmurs, you'll start answering back. You swallow hard and keep walking. Historians still argue whether this ceaseless bickering was intended as punishment, relief, or simply what mortals would have done anyway. One text describes the underworld as a theater where every soul rehearses their grievances forever, too stubborn to let go. You pass a long row of shades now, their whispering blending into a soft drone. One shade sits cross-legged on a bench, muttering accusations to no one in particular, while another paces back and forth, shaking her head furiously. You watch silently, feeling the heavy weight of all their words pressing against the walls. Hades finally stops at the far end of the hall, resting his hand against the stone doorway. Sometimes, he says, I wonder if they'd even know what to do with silence. You glance back once more, watching the shades lean toward each other, whispering, faster now, as though afraid they might run out of time. Then you step through the doorway after him. The corridor beyond is quieter, the murmuring fading into a faint echo behind you. It feels cooler here, and the air smells faintly metallic, like rain on stone. Ahead, the tunnel widens into a vaulted chamber, where a single slab of polished obsidian stands upright, carved with faint runes that shimmer as you approach. On either side of the slab stand two tall figures robed in shadow, their faces obscured by hoods. They don't move, but you feel their presence keenly. Hades stops before the slab, his hands clasped behind him. "This is where the petitions come," he says softly. You glance at him questioningly. "From the living," he adds after a moment. You blink, startled. Sure enough, as you step closer, you see faint shapes moving within the stone scraps of parchment, spoken words, desperate prayers, all flickering like embers before fading into the dark. You press your hand lightly against the surface and feel it hum faintly under your fingers. Hades watches you quietly, his expression unreadable. "They rarely ask for the right things," he murmurs. You let your hand fall away, watching the last faint word vanish into the depths. Quirky little tidbit. Some ancient stories claim that mortals could bribe their way into the underworld court with offerings of honey and wine, and that Hades himself occasionally granted requests if they were clever enough to amuse him. You glance at Hades. "Does that ever happen?" you ask softly. He gives the faintest shrug. "Less than you'd think." You stand there for a while longer, letting the strange quiet of the chamber settle around you, the runes pulsing faintly like a heartbeat. Then Hades turns and begins walking again. You follow him into another corridor, this one lined with faint carvings of animals, birds, lions, serpents, each etched into the stone with remarkable detail. The path opens at last into a smaller balcony overlooking yet another river below. This one moves quickly, its surface broken by little waves of light. You lean against the railing, watching the water rush past, and listen to the faint sound of the shades gossiping far behind you. You glance at Hades. "Do you ever listen in?" you ask. His lips twitch faintly. "Why would I do that?" he murmurs. You can't help but smile. "For all their complaints, they're still yours," you point out. For a moment, he's quiet. Then he says simply, "They are." The river below glimmers faintly as it curls out of sight into the shadows. You stand there at the railing, the hum of the water and the faint murmur of the shades blending together into something almost musical. You close your eyes, letting it wash over you, and feel the strange calm of the underworld settle deeper into your bones. You open your eyes and find Hades watching you quietly, his expression calm but thoughtful. "Ready?" he asks. You nod, and together, you leave the whispers behind. You follow Hades along a narrow corridor that seems to spiral downward without end. The faint sound of rushing water echoes somewhere far below, though you can't see it yet. The air grows cooler again, sharper somehow, with a metallic scent, like iron. After a few more turns, the path straightens into a wide hallway, lit faintly by flickering torches that cast long shadows. You notice a faint golden shimmer on the floor ahead, like spilled light pooling on the stone. At the end of the hall stands a single pedestal, and on it rests a scroll sealed with Zeus's lightning sigil. Hades stops several paces away and folds his arms. "Olympus sends a memo," he says flatly. You glance at the scroll, then at him. He doesn't move toward it. You clear your throat quietly. "Aren't you going to open it?" Hades tilts his head just slightly, his expression somewhere between amusement and disdain. "I already know what it says." You arch an eyebrow. "Let me guess. Another invitation to come up and join the family?" His lips twitch faintly, something like that. You move closer to the pedestal and peer at the scroll. The seal hums faintly, and little sparks crackle across its surface. When you reach out, you pull your hand back instinctively. Quirky fact for you. In some old accounts, Zeus was so fond of sending messages that he supposedly once sent 30 identical invitations to the same banquet, just to make sure no one could claim they hadn't been told. Some myths even say he enchanted his scrolls to scream the recipient's name until they were opened. You glance at the scroll again, and are relieved when it stays blessedly quiet. Historians still argue whether Hades refused Olympus out of pride, principle, or simply exhaustion with their antics. Some believe he came once a century, just to remind them he still existed. You look at him curiously. Do you ever answer? Hades gives a faint shrug. Sometimes, when I'm bored. You stare at him. And are you bored now? His gaze meets yours, dark and steady. Not yet. You chuckle softly and step back from the pedestal. So, what happens if you don't reply? You ask. He glances toward the shadows beyond the hall. Nothing. That's the point. You can't help but smile at that. He turns away from the pedestal and continues walking. You follow, leaving the faintly sparking scroll behind. The next corridor opens into a large antechamber, its walls lined with faintly glowing murals. You pause to study them as you pass. One shows Zeus hurling a thunderbolt toward the sea, Poseidon rising from the waves, and Hades standing calmly below, arms folded, watching them both. Another depicts a vast banquet hall, full of gods laughing, cups raised high, while at the edge of the image, Hades is painted small and dark, his back already turned. You glance at him again as you walk, and he catches your eye just briefly before looking away, at the far end of the chamber. You come to a heavy door carved with intricate patterns. Hades presses his palm against it, and it swings open with a soft groan. On the other side is another balcony, this one higher and wider than the others, overlooking a river that glows faintly silver below. The air here is cooler and still. Hades rests his hands lightly on the railing and gazes out across the water. You stand beside him quietly. You ever think about going back? You ask softly. His eyes stay fixed on the river. Once, he says. A long time ago. You wait, but he doesn't elaborate. Quirky detail. Some rare stories claim Hades did climb back to Olympus once, during a particularly violent war among the gods. But no one could agree on whether he came to help, to stop them, or just to watch. You lean against the railing, watching the faint ripples on the river below. The water here seems to move differently, slower and deeper, as though it carries memories rather than reflections. A faint shape glides along the far bank, a lone figure draped in shadows. Head bowed, you watch silently as it disappears around a bend in the river. Hades finally speaks. They don't even notice. When I'm gone, he murmurs. You glance at him. You sure about that? His mouth curves faintly, though not quite into a smile. After a moment, he pushes away from the railing and starts down another set of stairs that hug the edge of the balcony. You follow. Your footsteps quiet against the stone. At the bottom of the stairs, the path splits. One way leading back toward the familiar glow of the terraces, the other deeper into shadow. Hades takes the darker path without hesitation. You trail him, the quiet pressing closer now. The air cooler still. The corridor ends in a small chamber where a single bench sits before a faintly glowing wall of polished stone. Hades sits, resting his hands on his knees, and you join him quietly. The glow from the wall paints the room in silver light. For a while, neither of you speak. Then he says softly, I stopped showing up after Persephone came. You look at him, because of her, because I didn't need to anymore. His voice is calm, even. You glance at the wall of stone. Faint images shift across its surface: gardens, rivers, feasts, battles, but none of them linger for long. You murmur, do they still send the invitations every year? He says with a faint smirk, like clockwork. You lean back against the wall, watching the images fade in and out, and you never answer any more. He shakes his head once, not once. You close your eyes, letting the quiet settle around you. and hear the faint whisper of the river far below. And in that moment you understand why he never visits Olympus. Because here, in the stillness of his own realm, he already has everything he needs. You sit there next to him a little longer in the silver glow of the wall, watching the faint images shimmer and fade until even they seem to grow quiet. The silence here is different somehow, not heavy but deep, like sinking into still water. He finally rises, brushing the dust from his robes and gestures for you to follow. You stand and trail after him as he leads you back out into another winding corridor. This one is long and straight-lined, with faint carvings that catch the torchlight. In soft patterns you realize after a moment that the designs are not random but scenes, the underworld itself depicted as a great city winding down and down into the earth. At the end of the corridor you pass through an arch and into a broad chamber. The walls here are smooth and clean, the floor polished so well it faintly reflects the glow of torches. A quiet weight hangs in the air, as though the stones themselves are holding their breath. Hades stops in the center of the room and folds his arms, surveying it with what almost seems like pride. You glance around and realize the entire chamber is empty, at least at first glance. Then you notice the details. Along the walls, shelves carved into the stone hold small objects carefully arranged. A single mask rests on one shelf, a bronze dagger on another, a cluster of what looks like pomegranate seeds frozen in glass on a third. It takes you a moment to understand this is his collection. Hades notices you looking and murmurs softly. The interior design leaves much to be desired. You let out a faint laugh despite yourself. He gestures at the shelves. These are what's left behind, he says. Not everyone takes everything with them. You step closer to one of the shelves and study a delicate golden comb that catches the light. It looks almost ordinary, yet you can feel something in it, a faint hum like it remembers where it came from. Quirky fact: some myths claim Hades kept a private chamber where he stored objects that fascinated him, not out of greed, but because he saw beauty in what everyone else forgot. Ancient writers even suggested that these collections were gifts left behind by mortals who found his company unexpectedly comforting. At the end, you glance at him, but he's already moved to stand near another shelf, adjusting a small dark feather that seems to shimmer in colors you can't quite name. Historians still argue whether this chamber was intended as a kind of memorial or simply a personal curiosity of his. Whatever its purpose, it feels more like an artist's studio than a tomb. You walk slowly around the room, taking in the quiet arrangement of his treasures. A small lyre, missing one string, a faded garland of flowers, still faintly fragrant, a fragment of pottery painted with dancing figures. You pause at one shelf and reach out gently to touch what looks like a single pearl resting in a shallow dish. It's cool and heavy in your palm, and you wonder what story it carries. Hades watches you silently, his expression as unreadable as ever. When you set the pearl back, he finally says quietly, "I find it easier to keep them here than to let them vanish." You glance at him and offer a faint smile. "Have good taste," you say softly. This earns the faintest quirk of his lips. He moves to the far corner of the room, where another archway leads out, and gestures for you to follow. You step through into a narrower passage, its walls darker and rougher than before. The sound of water returns, now faint but constant. Somewhere ahead, at the end of the passage, the floor widens into a smooth platform, overlooking another river. This one is wide and black, its surface broken only by faint ripples that glint faintly in the torchlight. Hades stops at the edge of the platform and rests his hands on the railing, watching the water flow by. You join him, leaning against the cool stone below. Your faint lights drift along the river's surface, small and slow, like fireflies caught on the current. They are quiet now, too, drifting in silence, their faint glow the only sign of life. Hades tilts his head slightly, watching them pass. You ever name them? You ask softly. His gaze stays fixed on the water. No, he says, they name themselves if they need to. You watch the little lights float by one after another, their faint reflections shimmering on the black Water quirky details. Some old poets claimed the river carried not just souls but also forgotten dreams and wishes that mortals never dared to speak aloud, floating slowly through the underworld until they faded. You glance at him again, his profile still and calm against the glow of the water. Historians still argue whether Hades truly cared about these drifting souls, or whether he simply watched because it was his duty. Some believed his stillness meant indifference, others thought it hid something deeper. You stay there for a while longer, letting the soft sound of the river fill the silence. After a time, Hades straightens and turns away from the railing, his dark robes rippling slightly as he moves. You follow quietly back toward the chamber of shelves, through the long corridor, and out into another small hall. This one is simple, its walls bare, its floor smooth and cool. In the center sits a single chair carved from black stone with faint designs etched into its arms. Hades lowers himself into the chair, his movements quiet and deliberate, and rests one hand lightly against the armrest. This is where he sits when there's nothing left to do, when the underworld is running as it should, when the rivers flow, and the ghosts whisper, and Persephone tends her flowers. He gazes ahead quietly, and for the first time since you arrived, he truly looks at rest. You sit on the floor nearby, letting the silence settle around you like a soft weight, and as you watch him sitting there calm and still, you realize that the underworld's interior design is exactly what it needs to be. Not grand, not golden, not loud, just his. You rise slowly from where you'd been sitting on the cool stone, and follow Hades as he stands again. He moves toward a narrow archway at the edge of the chamber, this one much darker than the rest. The air here is different, faintly charged, almost expectant, and you can feel it prickling faintly at your skin. This way, he says softly, and you trail behind him into the dark. The passage is longer now, rougher, and carved more hastily than the others. You notice faint cracks in the stone, as though this path is not often used, and then you hear voices, not the whispering ghosts you've heard so far, but louder, sharper, echoing through the tunnel ahead. Hades slows slightly and glances back at you with a faint smirk. When mortals sneak in, he murmurs dryly. You raise your eyebrows, but say nothing. Letting him lead you forward, the tunnel opens at last into a jagged cavern, and there you see them, a pair of mortal figures, their clothes torn, eyes wide, clutching a torch and staring at the walls as though expecting monsters to leap from the shadows. Hades stops at the edge of the cavern, folding his arms, and simply watches. The two mortals spin at the faint sound of his robes and freeze. When they see him, one of them drops the torch, and it sputters on the ground before going out, leaving only the faint glow of the underworld to light the space. You stand just behind him and watch in silence. They never look where they're going. Hades says quietly. You bite back a small laugh. The mortals stand there, still as statues, their faces pale and stricken. What do you do with them? You whisper. Depends, he replies. Some find their way back, some don't. He steps forward just slightly, and both mortals immediately drop to their knees, mumbling something that sounds like apologies, though it's hard to tell. Hades studies them for a long moment before finally waving one hand faintly. The path home is behind you, he says softly. The mortals scramble to their feet, eyes wide with something like gratitude, and rush back toward the tunnel without looking back. You watch until their footsteps fade, and then glance at him. That happens a lot, you ask. He gives a faint shrug. More than you'd expect. Quirky fact. In some versions of the myths, heroes like Orpheus and Theseus wandered into the underworld on foolish quests, leaving chaos in their wake. But lesser known are the nameless mortals who also stumbled in, hoping to find lost loves or stolen fortunes, most of whom never made it out. Historians still argue whether these tales were meant to warn mortals about their limits, or simply entertain with stories of hubris and failure. Hades glances at you with a faint smirk. Heroes are the worst, he murmurs dryly. You chuckle under your breath, and follow him back into the corridor as you walk. You can still faintly hear the fading echoes of the mortal's footsteps behind you. The passage opens again into another chamber, this one quieter and smaller, its walls etched with faint star patterns that glow softly in the dim light. In the center of the room stands a tall mirror, framed in black stone. Hades stops before it and studies his own reflection for a moment before stepping aside. So you can see. You step closer, peering into the glass. At first you see yourself faint, pale, a little uncertain, but then the reflection shifts. You glimpse other mortals in the glass, flashes of stories that seem half-remembered. A hero with a lyre, a woman carrying a torch, a figure dragging chains through the dust. It's strange and mesmerizing. What is it, you whisper? The mirror shows what they think they are. Hades murmurs, not what they are. You watch as your reflection blurs briefly into someone you don't quite recognize before returning to yourself. You step back slightly, unsettled, and glance at him. Do you ever look? You ask. His mouth curves faintly. Once he says simply. You wonder what he saw, but you don't ask. Instead, you let the quiet of the chamber settle around you, the faint glow of the stars on the walls reflecting softly in the mirror. After a long moment, Hades turns and walks toward another arched doorway, this one low and narrow. You follow him into yet another passage, this one smoother and lined with faint carvings of ships and waves. The air smells faintly of salt now, and you realize you can hear water ahead again. The path ends at the edge of a dark underground lake, where a small boat waits, gently bumping against the shore. Hades glances at you. Not all of them sneak in, he says softly. Some are invited. You watch silently, as the boat drifts slightly closer of its own accord. You step toward it, feeling the cool mist on your skin, and glance at him once more, and you take them across. If they deserve it, he murmurs, quirky little detail. Some stories claim that Hades himself sometimes ferried the dead across the water when Charon was elsewhere. Those few lucky enough to ride with him claimed the journey was silent, swift, and strangely peaceful. You stand quietly beside him, watching the water ripple softly against the boat. After a while, he turns back to the path, and you follow. Behind you, the boat drifts back into the shadows, waiting for the next one, and you realize that even here, in the quietest corners of his realm, mortals still find their way in, one way or another. You leave the lake behind, the sound of its quiet ripples fading into memory as you follow Hades back into the winding corridors. This time the path seems warmer, the air softer somehow, and you catch a faint scent of pomegranate and spice drifting toward you. He glances back briefly, then slows his pace, as though giving you a chance to prepare. Ahead, a golden glow begins to seep through the darkness, and you recognize it at once. Persephone is waiting. You step into another terrace, smaller than her garden from before, but just as lush, with vines curling along the columns and little blossoms spilling onto the floor like jewels. She sits at a low table set for two, her hair caught up loosely and her hands resting lightly on the surface. The table is simple but beautiful. Plates of honey cakes, ripe figs, bowls of pomegranate seeds glinting in the warm light. Hades stops just at the edge of the terrace and inclines his head faintly. Persephone looks up at you and smiles, her expression calm and warm. Sit, she says gently. You hesitate, then lower yourself into one of the chairs. Hades moves to the other, his robes whispering against the floor as he sits. The air here feels different, less heavy, almost comforting, and the faint hum of the underworld beyond seems muted by the glow of the room. Persephone picks up a small bowl and offers it to you. You glance inside. Pomegranate seeds glisten like tiny rubies, each one perfect and bright. Go on, she says lightly. They're safe tonight. You take one between your fingers, feeling its cool weight, before popping it into your mouth. It bursts with sweetness. a little tart, but not unpleasant, and you can't help but smile faintly. Persephone laughs softly. Hades leans back slightly, watching the two of you with quiet amusement. For a while, no one speaks. The three of you simply sit together, sharing bites of fruit and sips of wine from delicate cups. Quirky fact: in some lesser-known hymns, Persephone was said to have a wicked sense of humor at these dinners, teasing even Zeus himself when he visited. And it's said that her pomegranates were enchanted to taste different to everyone. For some, sweet as honey; for others, sharp as vinegar. You glance at Hades as he quietly picks at a few seeds, his expression softer now than you've seen it all night. Historians still argue whether the famous story of her being taken was truly a kidnapping or something more like an elopement. Some texts suggest she walked into the underworld willingly, simply because no one else had ever thought to ask her. You watch the two of them together now, his faint smirk when she scolds him lightly for leaving footprints on her clean floor, the way her fingers brush his sleeve as she pours more wine, and you start to believe the latter. At one point, Persephone looks at you and tilts her head curiously. "What do you see down here?" she asks softly. You pause, thinking, and then say, "Quiet." She smiles at that, her eyes lighting faintly. "Good," she murmurs. "That's what we like to hear." You laugh quietly, and Hades leans back in his chair, a faint look of satisfaction crossing his face. For a while longer, you sit like this, the faint hum of the underworld beyond, mixing with the soft clink of cups and plates. At one point, Persephone nudges a bowl of honeycakes toward you. "Try these," she insists. You do, and they're delicious, sweet, and warm, almost melting on your tongue. You glance around the room, taking in the curling vines, the faint golden light, the way the air seems to settle like a gentle blanket, and you realize you could sit here for a very long time. Quirky detail: a handful of ancient poets claimed that eating with Hades and Persephone in their private dining room could lull even the angriest spirit into peace, and that some of the dead never left afterward, choosing to stay as guests forever. You sip from your cup, savoring the soft spices in the wine, and glance at Hades, who meets your gaze briefly before looking back at Persephone. When at last the plates are empty and the candles burn lower, Persephone rises gracefully and begins to clear the table. Hades stands as well and gestures faintly for you to follow. You rise slowly, feeling the warmth of the room still clinging to your clothes as you step back toward the archway. Persephone gives you a quiet smile as you pass and murmurs, "Come back when you're ready." You nod, the faint sweetness of pomegranate still on your lips, and as you follow Hades back into the quiet corridor, you realize that dinner with them has been the calmest, strangest meal you'll ever attend, and you're not sure you'd ever trade it for anything else. The warmth of Persephone's terrace fades behind you as Hades leads you into another corridor. The air grows cooler again, shadows thickening around you. The faint hum of the underworld returns, soft and steady, like the low breath of something immense. You glance at him as you walk, his pace unhurried, but certain. After a long stretch of silence, you finally ask, "Why don't you visit Olympus anymore?" He doesn't look at you at first, his dark eyes fixed on the path ahead. Then, quietly, he answers, "Because they never notice when I'm there." You watch his profile as he continues, his voice calm, but edged with something sharper now. "They call me when they need something. When a war ends, when a hero dies, when a law must be enforced. But otherwise, I'm just another shadow in their halls." You walk in silence for a moment, letting his words sink in. You glance up at the faint carvings on the walls, scenes of feasts and battles, gods raising goblets and clashing swords, and realize that he appears in none of them. Historians still argue whether Hades' absence from Olympus was his choice, or whether the others quietly excluded him over centuries of feasts and festivals. Some say he withdrew to punish them, others say he simply grew tired of pretending. You reach a broad staircase now, descending into yet another chamber. The room is vast and dark, its ceiling lost in shadow. At the center, a single column of light falls from above, illuminating a circle of empty chairs. Hades steps into the light and looks around the chairs with faint amusement. They built this, he murmurs, for meetings they never had. You follow him into the circle and glance at the chairs, each one carved with a different symbol. Lightning, trident, lyre, dove. One chair, darker than the rest, sits just outside the light. Hades moves toward it, his robes brushing the floor. This was mine, he says. He rests a hand on the back of the chair but does not sit. You glance at him. Why not? He lifts his eyes to the ceiling, his gaze unreadable. Because no one ever looked this far down, he says quietly. Quirky fact. A handful of ancient writers claimed that Hades was invited to Olympus only once every 100 years, and that each time, he left early, slipping away before anyone noticed he was gone. They called him the invisible guest. You watch him trace the carved edge of the chair with his fingers before stepping back into the shadows. You follow him out of the circle, the empty chairs standing silent behind you. The next passage is narrower, the air cooler, and faint echoes of your footsteps bounce off the walls. You glance at him again, catching a faint smirk on his lips. What's funny? You ask softly. They still send me invitations, he murmurs. Every year, you laugh quietly under your breath. Do you ever even open them? He glances at you, and his mouth twitches. Sometimes, when I need a good joke, you chuckle and keep walking. The corridor opens into another balcony, overlooking the familiar meadows and rivers of the underworld. Hades leans on the railing, his eyes scanning the quiet expanse. They always assume I envy them, he says softly. Do you? You ask. He shakes his head once. They can keep their noise. The meadows below ripple gently, the silver grasses catching faint light, and the shades wander between the rivers. Quiet and steady. You stand there beside him, the air cool and calm, and you begin to understand what he means. This place, his place, is not a punishment. It is not exile. It is peace. Historians still argue whether Hades truly felt he belonged here, or if he simply resigned himself to it. But watching him now, you find it hard to believe it was anything but a choice. After a while, he straightens, and gestures back toward the corridor. Come, he says quietly. There's still one more thing you should see. You glance back at the empty circle of chairs, once more before following him into the shadows, and you realize that Olympus was never his home, but this quiet kingdom below has always been. You walk behind him as the path narrows again, turning through deeper layers of stone. The air here is cooler, sharper somehow, as though even the underworld holds its breath this far down. You notice that the walls are no longer carved. Instead, they're rough and dark, with faint veins of some mineral that catches the dim light. Hades slows his pace, his footsteps nearly silent now. At one point he glances back at you and asks, softly, do you ever wonder how I spend my nights? You hesitate, then nod. He smirks faintly and keeps walking. After a few more steps, the corridor opens into a wide chamber that takes your breath away. It's quiet here, but not empty. The room is filled with faint points of light, suspended in the air like a field of stars. Some hang high above, others drift lazily at eye level, glowing softly against the dark. Hades stands at the edge of the space and watches them. What is this? You whisper. His voice is calm when he answers. These are the stories no one finished. You step closer, watching the lights flicker faintly, as though alive. Some are brighter than others, some barely glow at all, but they all seem to hum faintly, a soft rhythm that you feel more than hear. Quirky detail. One obscure fragment of an Orphic hymn claims that Hades kept a hall where he collected the untold stories of the dead, poems left unfinished, songs never sung, final words unspoken, and listened to them on nights when even he could not sleep. You move deeper into the room, brushing your fingers near one of the lights. It flares softly, and you catch a whisper, a few words in a language you don't quite understand before it fades again. You glance at him. Do you listen to them all? You ask. Not all at once, he says simply. But some nights, he moves toward one faintly glowing sphere that hovers near the floor and crouches slightly to watch it. They don't always want to be heard, he adds after a moment. You kneel beside him, watching the little light pulse faintly before settling back into its gentle glow. For a while, you both sit there in silence, the soft glow of the room surrounding you like quiet music. Historians still argue whether this chamber was a later invention of poets or if it actually existed somewhere in the underworld. Some believe it was just a metaphor for memory. Others swear it was real, and that Hades himself tended to it as carefully as a garden. After a while, he rises and gestures for you to follow again. You walk through the soft field of lights, the faint hum of them brushing against your ears, and step back into another dark corridor. This one is smoother, colder. The sound of water returns now, faint and steady. Somewhere ahead, the path opens into a narrow balcony above a dark pool. Hades leans on the railing, his robes pooling around him. Below, the surface of the water is still and black. Occasionally, a faint ripple disturbs it, sending soft rings of light outward. You stand beside him, peering into the depths. What is this one? You murmur. His answer is quiet. This is where they come when they're done. You glance at him, unsure. Done. With speaking, with wandering, with remembering. You watch the water ripple again, faint and soft. Do they disappear? You ask. No, he says. They rest. Quirky fact. Some ancient traditions claimed that the deepest part of the underworld was not fire or darkness but calm, a still lake where the dead could finally sleep without dreams. You let your gaze drift across the water, watching the faint circles spread and fade. For a while neither of you speak. Then he says, almost to himself, they don't all make it here. You glance at him but say nothing, letting the silence stretch between you. The water below glows faintly, as though lit from within, soft and patient. You lean on the railing, feeling the chill of the stone beneath your hands, and realize you've never felt anything quite like this place, heavy and quiet, but gentle too. You glance at him again, watching the way his eyes linger on the water. You really don't miss Olympus, do you? You say softly. His mouth curves faintly, the closest thing to a smile. Not even a little. You stay there for another moment, watching the water settle back into perfect stillness, before he finally turns back toward the corridor. You follow him, one last time into the shadows. The quiet of the chamber still wrapped around you like a cloak, and you think to yourself, no wonder he spends his nights down here. You walk beside him now in silence, the corridor narrowing then widening into what feels like the deepest part of this vast world. The air here is cool, but not cold, carrying that same faint scent of stone and quiet. You've grown used to. The path opens at last into a small open space with no walls, no ceiling, just a platform of smooth rock extending into what looks like infinite darkness above and below. Hades stops at the edge of the platform, folds his hands behind his back, and looks out across the void. You step up beside him, the stone faintly warm under your feet, the darkness beyond so vast it almost hums. This is the quiet king at peace. You think he breathes slowly, shoulders relaxed as though the weight he wears everywhere else slides off here for a long time. Neither of you speak. You glance at him, the faintest curve of a smile, just barely visible at the corner of his mouth, as his eyes follow something unseen far below. Finally, he says softly, this is where it ends and begins. All at once, you nod, though you're not entirely sure what he means though. Faintest ripple of light stirs somewhere below, a soft glow that comes and goes like a heartbeat. He glances at you, dark eyes steady. When everything else fades, he murmurs this. is what remains. You glance down into the void, feeling the strange calm of it settle into you deeper than before. Quirky fact: some obscure myths spoke of a place beyond the rivers and meadows, a point even beyond Lethe, where even time was quiet, a space kept by Hades alone, where no god, no mortal, no whisper could reach you. Stand quietly at the edge, watching that faint pulse of light far below the hush of the air. Around you so deep it almost feels alive. Historians still argue whether this final place was something the Greeks truly believed in, or a poet's dream of peace that no one could find on earth. You take one last breath, feeling the weight and calm of it all, and then he turns away, hands loose at his sides, and begins walking slowly back toward the path. You follow him, knowing now why he preferred his quiet underworld over Olympus. Why anyone might, the hush of this place lingers, even as you step back into the tunnels, even as the faint hum of rivers and whispers returns to your ears, and for the first time you understand the quiet king completely. Walk behind him, through the winding halls, past the rivers, past the meadows, past the sleeping garden, past the three-headed dog who lifts his head lazily as you pass, past the circle of empty chairs and the mirror that no longer bothers to until at last you find yourselves back at the edge of the first balcony. You stand there together, looking down at it all: silver grasses, rivers glowing faintly, souls drifting slowly and quietly along their paths, and it feels like home to him, and maybe now even a little to you. Sit quietly at the edge of the balcony, letting the hush of the underworld wrap around you completely. Every sound seems softer now, every faint whisper and ripple fading into a gentle rhythm. You feel the cool stone beneath your palms, steady and calm, and notice how even your own breathing has slowed to match the deep quiet here. Hades stands just a little away, hands clasped lightly behind his back, eyes fixed on the silver meadows below. He does not speak, and for once neither do you, because there is nothing left that needs saying. The faint glow of the rivers reflects in his dark robes, and you watch as the quiet hum of the place softens even further. Somewhere far below you, catch a last glimpse of light, drifting slowly across the water, fading into the darkness, like a final thought, sliding into dreams. The air here is heavier, but also warmer somehow, as though the stone itself has taken on the softness of sleep. You let your eyes fall half closed, the soft hush of the underworld settling into your bones, until it feels as though you could lie right here and never wake. And perhaps that is the lesson he wanted you to see, that there is nothing to fear here, nothing to flee from, just stillness, just rest, just peace. You let the quiet hold you, and it does.